The world has witnessed several international conflicts and tensions in recent years, but they have not escalated to the scale or intensity of a war-like Israeli conflict with Hamas in recent years, as it has a potential of engulfing the whole Arab region, and it might be a catalyst to a new world order.
In the summer of 2000, the leaders of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization came to America at the invitation of United States President Bill Clinton. There were hopes of a resolution to a conflict which had lasted decades and killed thousands, but 2 weeks of negotiations broke. Up without agreement, each side blamed the other, and the war of words soon escalated into more violence on Israel's borders. They called it the Second Intifada, the Second Uprising.
We have this cycle of violence which seems to me absolutely impossible to break. It's been an aerial war, a war with intelligence, a war with spies, and a war of soldiers, and that war has gone consistently now for over 10 years. There is often a misconception that the conflict is essentially the result of cultural predispositions between two conflicting regions and two conflicting cultures, and that's just simply not true. You have extremists on both sides who feed off of hatred.
The roots of the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians go deep. With each passing year, they seem to grow more entangled. How did this bitter conflict begin? Were there opportunities to end the war that were missed? And how can peace be achieved when there is such implacable hatred and grievance on both sides? The British had been in Palestine for almost 3 decades. They had come in the aftermath of the First World War. They were leaving in the aftermath of the Second. Their administration had been a tumultuous one in the 1920s and 1930s. Thousands of Jews had immigrated to Palestine. There were violent clashes with the local Arab population. The British authorities were caught in between their attempts to limit further immigration that enraged the Jews. Their earlier support for a Jewish homeland enraged the Arabs, and the pressures only grew.
After the Second World War, it was clear to Britain, bankrupt as it was, that it would have to withdraw by 1947. The British should realize that the current status quo was completely unsustainable. It was no longer able to come up with a solution or even contain the conflict that was going on at the time between the two communities. They fought off 6 Arab armies, improvised weapons to establish and defend their territory, and they ended up with 2 slivers of territory which drove into Palestinian lands. A lot of Palestinians, some left voluntarily, some left because they were frightened, but most were driven out of their territories to create a Palestinian problem.
6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust survivors and had witnessed horrors beyond imagination. Many saw no future for themselves in Europe, and thousands tried to move to the Jews' historic homeland in the Middle East. The future of Palestine was instead put in the hands of the newly formed United Nations. In November 1947, a plan for the partition of Palestine was agreed. The news was met with jubilation among Jews and fury among Arabs. Violence broke out between the communities as British troops withdrew at midnight. On the 14th of May 1948, the British Mandate of Palestine came to an end. The State of Israel was born. It was attacked immediately.
That was a war in which the Arab nations clearly were about to attack Israel. Israel had, as it were, both a legal and moral right to strike first, and they did strike first. So you ended up having the West Bank and Gaza, which after 1948 you had the West Bank that was part of Jordan, and then the Gaza Strip that was then part of Egypt.
Forces from Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt secured Arab territories in Palestine and launched military offensives against the new Jewish state. Israel may have triumphed, but the fledgling state still surrounded and outnumbered. Numbered on its destruction, the violence which surrounded the country's birth would continue. The Six-Day War of 1967 saw Israel seized territory from Jordan and Syria and sweep across the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. Israel natives struck back in 1973. Surprise attack on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur began another round of violence. The fighting led Egypt and Israel to negotiating table. The Camp David Accords returned to Sinai to Egypt, but Israel kept East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip, and it was not just land the Israelis had acquired. Over 1 million Palestinian Arabs lived in the occupied territories. It was the start of another long and bloody struggle and a very different kind of war. On one side were the increasingly powerful Israeli armed forces, on the other were the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO targeted Israeli soldiers and civilians alike. They attacked buses, hotels, and schools. The Israelis responded with raids on PLO camps abroad, with assassinations of leading militants and civilians, and with more and more settlements on occupied Palestinian land. The war seemed intractable. But in the early 1990s, secret peace talks began. The talks led to the Oslo Accords.
Again, was an immediate and desperate response from both the Palestinian and Israeli leadership in response to the First and Father, which really proved to both that the current status quo was completely unsustainable and it is based on a two-state solution. So there shall be an Israeli state guaranteed that the Arab neighbors of Israel should give up all of their rhetoric that they want to destroy Israel and must be seen to do so, and guarantee Israel's security. In return for that, the Palestinians shall have an independent state, not just an autonomous territory, but an independent state, and Jerusalem shall be a free city. So the Palestinian Authority were an interim governing authority created through the Oslo Accords, and they were essentially tasked with the social welfare provision and security provision in the in occupying Palestinian territories.
And the establishment of a Palestinian Authority. This promised an elected government for Palestinians in parts of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. After the failure of the Camp David summit in 2000, violence flared once again, and the hopes of peace were soon to take another blow. In 2006, the hardline Islamist group Hamas won elections in Palestine. In their founding charter was a commitment to the total destruction of the Israeli state. In the early 2000s, violence erupted once again between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Efforts to end their long-running conflict had ground to a halt. The fighting that followed lasted more than 4 years. Thousands died. This is a conflict driven by old disputes and unresolved grievances where each side blames the other. By January 2006, the violence of the Second Intifada had eased. At last, elections were held in the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The poll was overdue. Voting had been delayed by a dispute over the electoral system and by fears over who would win. Under the control of the Fatah Party, the Palestinian Authority had become a byword for incompetence and corruption. Fatah's leaders could agree on almost nothing, and the people had noticed. Fatah's political dominance was threatened by the rise of another party, Hamas.
Hamas as being the armed wing of the Palestinian strand of a Muslim Brotherhood, as they were created specifically for that reason in 1987. Hamas managed to essentially transform itself from being a marginalized political, social, military organization into a deeply embedded and sophisticated art of Palestinian politics. Hamas is pretty anti-Semitic. They say that you simply cannot trust the Jews, you cannot trust the Israelis, and Hamas represents a rejection both of the peace process and of the Palestinian Authority. I can understand these Israeli perspective. If Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the map, which they say they do, then Hamas cannot be included in any sort of peace dialogue that there should be.
Israel, the United States, and the European Union had all declared Hamas a terrorist organization. But that did not dent its popularity in Palestine. When the elections finally came, the results stunned the world. The election plunged the Palestinian Authority into crisis. Tensions between Hamas and Fatah grew as they squabbled over control of the security forces.
The problem for the outside world with Hamas is that Hamas has many deficiencies, but lack of popular legitimacy is not among one of them. And so anyone who condemns Hamas as merely a terrorist group has got to take on board the idea that 1.5 million people in Gaza seem to back it. Immediately after the elections, Hamas sought to create a unity government. With further negotiations and broken down, and Fatah outright refused. The US intelligence service had already armed them to then go ahead and carry out military coup against Hamas. But before that plan could get underway, Hamas intelligence had kind of intercepted the plan, and they had therefore preemptively taken over the Gaza Strip, and that's what essentially led the Hamas takeover and setting up of the de facto government in Gaza. The Israeli attempt was going to squeeze Gaza as long as you have Hamas as your leaders, and then you will suffer their blockade. And they blockaded Gaza. They prevented Gaza from receiving anything. They didn't want them to receive foods, medicine, and building materials. So, for example, there was a ban on things like pasta, chocolate, school textbooks, school chemistry textbooks. It was very arbitrary. Pretty much everything was banned, even lentils.
In June 2007, the Palestinian Authority was split in two. In the West Bank, Fatah retained control, but in Gaza, Hamas tightened its grip. Thousands have fled there after the founding of Israel in 1948. More than half a century on the Gaza Strip has become one of the most densely populated places on the planet. Life for civilians in Gaza was not easy, even before Hamas seized control in 2007. After the takeover, things got worse, much worse. In response to the blockade, Hamas militants bombarded Israel with hundreds of rockets, and Israel retaliated with mortar and airstrikes. In 2008, Egypt managed to broker a ceasefire. The rocket attacks from Hamas were to stop Israel, would halt the airstrikes, and as part of the agreement, the longer the truce held, the more open the borders would become. The love offered respite to civilians on both sides. Goods began to flow again, but it lasted just 6 months. The ceasefire collapsed in December 2008. Yet again, each side blamed the other. Israel launched Operation Cast, led F-16 fighter jets, and Apache helicopters led the attack. In the first 4 minutes of the operation, 100 targets were hit. For 22 days afterwards, the Israelis continued to pound Gaza. A ground offensive began, and soldiers penetrated deep into Gaza City. The Israelis said their strikes were pinpoint attacks on Hamas targets, but in such a densely populated area, civilian casualties were inevitable. By mid-January, up to 1,400 Gazans had been killed, among them 313 children. In the face of growing international condemnation, Israel ended the operation. On the 18th of January 2009, among the targets of the Israeli offensive, a network of tunnels, thousands of Gazans worked on them. Some tunnels were defensive, used to store weapons or offer shelter for Hamas officials. Other tunnels were for attack to deliver fighters across the fence to Israel, and some were used to cross the Fee border with Egypt, bypassing the economic blockade.
The tunnels have provided one of the very few means that they have to access the very essential things that they need to survive the Israelis, invading Gaza. They've tried to block the tunnels. They've bombed them. They have tried to locate the tunnels. They have done quite a lot, but they could never stop. They could never stop them being used. They did all they can to try to make these tunnels impossible.
For a time in 2012, Hamas had a friend across the border in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood held power in Cairo. Hamas were their allies, and goods flowed across the border into the Gaza Strip. In 2013, however, the Muslim Brotherhood were overthrown in a coup. The new military government of Egypt was far less friendly to their neighbors in Gaza. The underground network joining Gaza to the outside world was systematically picked apart. By 2014, Hamas was in a financial crisis. Without the flow of smuggled goods to tax the income of the government collapsed, almost half the adult Gazan population were unemployed. Millions had little access to clean water. Power shortages were widespread. The United Nations declared a humanitarian emergency. Despite the suffering in Gaza, Hamas remained popular. Their defiance was attractive. Many Gazans blamed Israel or the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank for their troubles instead. While there remained a fight for the hearts of Palestinians, Hamas had an interest in prolonging the conflict with Israel. Politics can perpetuate violence and a siege mentality, and this is no less true of the other side in this wall. Israel, as in Gaza, a hardline approach can be a vote-winning one.
The 8th of May, 1972. Sabina Flight 571 had just left Vienna when 4 armed Palestinians entered the cockpit. They ordered the pilot to land at Lord, the largest airport in Israel. The 2 men and 2 women then demanded the release of more than 300 Palestinians imprisoned in Israel. The Israeli government, led by Prime Minister Golda Meir, began negotiation. As the hours ticked by, the hijackers allowed a group of white-clad technicians to approach the plant. There was a problem with the hydraulics. If the Boeing 707 was to take off again, it would have to be fixed. But the men in white were not mechanics. They were soldiers from the elite Serat Matkal unit of Israel's Special Forces. The disguised Israeli commandos stormed the hijacked plane. It was over in minutes. The 2 male Palestinians were killed. The 2 women were captured. A hostage was fatally wounded, and 1 commando was shot in the arm. He was a young soldier nearing the end of his time in the military. His name was Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu would go on to become one of the most successful politicians in Israeli history. He would be prime minister longer than the country's founding father, David Ben-Gurion, and he more than anyone else would shape the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the early 21st century. After serving as Israeli ambassador to the UN during the 1980s, Netanyahu returned home and began a political rise. In 1993, he was elected leader of the right-wing Likud party. A coalition of nationalists Likud had broken the domination of the left in the 1970s and remade Israel's political landscape. In 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu was the party's candidate for prime minister. He narrowly won the election, but his first term in office would be short. As part of the peace process in 1998, Israel ceded territory in the West Bank to Palestine. Netanyahu's right-wing allies were outraged. His ruling coalition collapsed. An election followed, which Netanyahu lost, but he did not give up on his political career. 10 years later, he became prime minister once again. This time, Netanyahu would not be risking his future on compromises with the Palestinians. After the 2008 Israeli incursion into Gaza, an uneasy and unofficial truths had held. There were still Hamas rockets and secret Israeli raids. People were still dying, but a full-scale war had been avoided until 2012. It began with a drone strike, the targeted assassination of Hamas leader Ahmed Jabari. Jabari was the man blamed by Israel for masterminding the rocket attacks on their civilians. In the days that followed, more strikes hit positions all over the Gaza Strip. They targeted Hamas headquarters and ammunition stores, as well as civilian infrastructure. Hamas responded with a surge of Katyusha rocket fire. These were indiscriminate attacks targeting cities and civilians. Many of the rockets were intercepted by the latest innovation from Israel's world-leading defense industry. Iron Dome missile shield was the most advanced air defense system ever deployed, and this was its biggest test yet. The number of missiles shot down is disputed, but in the week-long conflict, just 6 Israelis were killed by Hamas rockets. Israel's military superiority had guaranteed victory. The Israeli public overwhelmingly backed their prime minister, but some could not help noting that Operation Pillar of Defense had come just weeks before parliamentary elections. Despite losing seats, they could remain the largest party. Benjamin Netanyahu stayed on as prime minister. He began his 3rd term facing an old question. How could the conflict with the Palestinians be resolved? At the urging of the Americans, peace talks resumed, but they soon ran into trouble. The disputed settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank continued to expand. In April 2014, the peace talks collapsed. Peace was apparently impossible. Tipping back into open conflict would prove all too easy. In June 2014, 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped and murdered in the West Bank. Operation was launched to find those responsible. 350 Palestinians were arrested, including leading Hamas officials. Tensions rose quickly. A Palestinian youth was killed by a gang of Israeli nationalists. Rockets were fired from Gaza. Then, on the 8th of July, Israel began Operation Protective Edge. Once again, the Gaza Strip became a war zone. International attempts to secure a ceasefire faltered. On the 17th of July 2014, a ground offensive was launched. By the end of the 7-week operation, 20,000 homes in Gaza had been destroyed, more than 2,000 Palestinians had been killed. Elections were soon due in Israel once again. Netanyahu had been in power for 6 years, and a close race was predicted. Netanyahu called for a nationality bill, which would define Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people and the Jewish people alone, and he confirmed no Palestinian state would come into being during his next term. The remarks were often controversial, criticized at home and abroad, but they seemed to work. Netanyahu won a 4th term as prime minister. But Likud had cannibalized the support of previous allies, and government to form a new administration. They would have to rely on nationalist parties, even more hostile to the peace process. Benjamin Netanyahu was nearing the 10-year anniversary of his second stint in power, but his political dominance was waning. Police began an investigation into possible corruption, passed a motion condemning the ongoing construction of settlements on occupied lands. But if Netanyahu was weakened domestically, he soon acquired a powerful new ally on the international scene. Relations with the administration of Barack Obama had become difficult. There is exasperation in the White House about the Israeli Prime Minister's attitude to the peace process. But Obama's time in office was coming to an end. The presidential election was due, and a political bombshell was about to go off.
In November 2016, Donald J. Trump won the presidential election. The controversial Republican stunned the world with his unexpected triumph. It was a result which was welcomed by the government in Jerusalem. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had known Donald Trump for years. Now his friend was in the White House. The new president promised change. He did not disappoint. He announced that the United States would recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and relocate its embassy to the city. The move delighted many American supporters of Israel. The government of Benjamin Netanyahu hailed the announcement as well, but it was condemned by governments around the world. Even old American allies in Europe expressed their concern. They had their embassies in Tel Aviv and had no intention of moving them. Protests soon scarred the West Bank and Gaza. In spring 2018, a campaign of weekly mass demonstrations began. They called it the Great March of Return. President Trump soon enraged the protesters again. In March 2019, just weeks before another Israeli general election, he welcomed Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House. The president announced that the United States would become the first country to endorse the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights. In January 2020, the Trump administration unveiled the final part of its long-awaited peace plan. It promised a Palestinian state, but gave Israel more land in return, and the plan was dependent on Hamas giving up power in Gaza. It was immediately rejected by the Palestinians. Trump came to office promising to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but a lasting peace seems as far away as ever. Hamas still holds sway in the Gaza Strip. More than a decade after seizing power, their defiance towards Israel remains popular. Their dispute with rivals Fatah goes on. In Israel, 2 general elections in 2019 and a third in March 2020 have all failed to produce a stable government. Benjamin Netanyahu may have become the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history, but his political future seems increasingly uncertain. More than 70 years have now passed since the founding of Israel. The decades have been stained by grief and bloodshed, but today the once fragile new country thrives, a wealthy and powerful democracy. For the Palestinians, life, especially in the Gaza Strip, seems to grow ever more difficult with each passing year. There remains no sign of an end to the conflict. Any lasting peace will involve compromise, but compromise is unpopular, and in Palestine, Israel, and America, the demands of politics have too often triumphed over the needs of peace. The roots of the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians go deep. With each passing year, they seem to grow more entangled.
The world has witnessed several international conflicts and tensions in recent years, but they have not escalated to the scale or intensity of a war like Israeli conflict with Hamas in recent years, as it has a potential of engulfing the whole Arab region, and it might be a catalyst to a new world order.